So as we've been telling you, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is staying behind bars in Tennessee while the Justice Department argues with his lawyers in the court over whether he'll be deported if he's released. The judge had ordered him to be released from jail while he waits for his trial, which is on human smuggling charges. Federal officials had told the court he'd be detained and deported as soon as he got out. Now, Abrego Garcia was returned to the U.S., as you remember, I'm sure, after being mistakenly deported to El Salvador. Trump administration, after quickly saying that it couldn't bring him back, then charged him with these smuggling charges, smuggling migrant workers into the U.S. Here with more, former ICE Director John Sandweg. Thoughts on this, John? That he's staying in prison for now, at least, while they go back and forth.
Yeah, it's an interesting case, Connell. I mean, so the federal court has decided that for the criminal case, he's bond eligible, meaning he's not a threat to public safety. He's not a flight risk. And as you know, the judge was critical about the government's evidence about whether or not he was a threat. So if they release him, ICE has the ability, the federal court's order does not bind ICE from detaining him. But he would be bond eligible in immigration court. So you could see a scenario where he has a very similar for an immigration judge with really the same two questions. Is he a public safety threat? Is he a flight risk? You might get a different decision, though. And that's what's interesting about it. You have a federal court saying he's not a public safety threat. You very well could have an immigration judge saying he is. Either way, I think what the government is saying, as soon as they get an immigration judge to modify, if they can get an immigration judge, basically to lift this ban on him going to El Salvador, this withholding or removal, they're going to execute the removal order. But it's a really interesting kind of case where you don't see too often, Connell, where you have these criminal authorities kind of blending with the immigration all combined.
Right, so they have to kind of, one plays off the other. But what about the fact, what about the merits of the question about flight risk and or being a threat?
Well, again, so the government, obviously failed in the federal court under the Bail Reform Act. Now they would go over to the immigration court. It is basically the same standard. Arguably, the burden is on Abrego Garcia in immigration court. It would not be unusual, though, and I don't say this cynically, but an immigration judge is not a true judge in a sense. And it's quite possible, though, that they're looking at the evidence, or just because of the burden shift, they make a determination that he is a public safety threat. On the flight risk, I think that's hard to prove here. Look, Abrego Garcia certainly doesn't. He wants his. I think everything he's shown is proven he wants his day in court, but there could be an argument by the government that he might just disappear into the U.S. And not appear in immigration court proceedings because he's nervous about being deported. But in any event, this will be really interesting to see how this plays out once he's released from criminal custody. What happens in the immigration court? What
about the charges themselves? Do you have thoughts on, from what you know, about what they have on him in terms of these smuggling charges? What would you say about the charges?
Connell, these are the kind of things that happen every day in migrant communities. I think what's interesting in this case, and we're going to find out about the veracity of the charges, right? There will be court hearings where they have to set up and prove the evidence here as to whether or not he's guilty. He will be entitled to a trial, right? And they'll have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. I think, I'm going to wait till I see that evidence to make a decision on that. What I will just say is this. Clearly, the government put a lot of effort into a case that they normally wouldn't put as much investigative resources into this. A lot of work went into identifying these witnesses, right? Getting them to cooperate with the government. You don't normally see it on these kind of charges. You just don't. Every day, ICE encounters people like this, Border Patrol, where they're driving large groups of aliens, somewhere in the United States, and we don't typically charge those individuals. This is obviously a special case, but as far as it relates to his guilt or innocence, we'll see.
All right, John, as always, thank you, John Sandweg. Now, still.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.